My name is Carmen, a senior accountant living in Franklin, Tennessee. I've spent my whole life being the reliable one, the one who cleans up everyone else's mess until the people I called family decided to clean out my son's future. My younger brother stole my 12-year-old son's rare baseball card collection, a precious heirloom from his great-grandfather, and sold it for $350,000 just to fund a lavish honeymoon. When my son found out my parents actually took my brother's side, they said, "James is the one who truly deserves the family heirlooms from his grandfather." I stood frozen in front of the wide-open safe in the basement, staring at the empty void as my heart sank. James stood there hand in hand with his new bride, his face devoid of even a shred of guilt. My parents stood firmly in front of him as if shielding a hero, their eyes looking at me with cold defiance. They expected me to break down, to scream, and to beg for mercy as I always had. But I didn't. My son didn't cry. He simply looked straight into James's smug face and let out a chilling, thin smile. That collection was actually... His trailing sentence made the air turn thick. I clearly saw the look on my parents' and James's faces shift from arrogance to deathly pale in just a single second. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family only noticed when they need something to steal? Let me know your story down in the comments. What is the truth behind that collection that made them turn so pale? Subscribe now and join me as we expose this charade right now. The moment Thomas's voice trailed off in that suffocating room, I saw a flicker of genuine fear cross my father Matthew's eyes. It was a brief, jagged spark of uncertainty that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced immediately by the practiced mask of patriarchal outrage. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and forced, as he took a step toward my son, with his finger pointed like a loaded weapon. My mother Carolyn was faster, letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed unpleasantly off the basement's concrete walls. She reached out and gripped the edge of the empty safe, her knuckles white before turning her venomous gaze toward Thomas. "You little liar!" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and fury. "You're just like your mother, always trying to stir up drama where there is none. That collection was exactly what James said. It was dusty old paper that was better off being liquidated for something useful." James didn't say a word, but his smug expression faltered for a heartbeat as he glanced at his wife Clara, who was busy checking her reflection in the darkened screen of her phone. The silence in the room became a physical weight pressing against my chest. My parents weren't just defending a thief. They were actively gaslighting a 12-year-old child to protect their golden son's ego. Matthew turned his attention back to me, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. "You need to be the adult here, Carmen." He barked, his voice booming with an unearned authority he had used to control me for decades. "James has a future to build. He's a Henderson, and he needs to start his marriage with the status he deserves. You've always been the independent one, the one who doesn't need handouts. Stop being so incredibly selfish, and let your brother have this one win." I looked at Thomas, expecting to see tears or the trembling shoulders of a betrayed child. Instead, I saw a boy who looked like he was watching a poorly acted play. He stood perfectly still, his back straight as a spine of a rare book, his eyes cool and observant. He wasn't looking at them with anger. He was looking at them with a clinical sort of pity. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in this house of cards. My son wasn't a victim. He was an ally who had already seen through the facade long before I did. A wave of clarity washed over me, sharper and colder than any winter frost in Tennessee. I looked at the luxury rugs, the expensive crown molding, and the high-end appliances in this kitchen, all things I had secured for them. I remembered the 15 years I spent managing Matthew's chaotic business ledgers for free, the countless times I had co-signed loans for James's failed startups, and the hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax exemptions I had personally filed to keep this estate from being repossessed by the bank. I had been the engine driving their lives, the invisible architect of their comfort, and in return, they had treated my son's heritage like a personal slush fund. Carolyn stepped closer, her perfume cloying and sweet, trying to soften her tone into that manipulative, mother knows best register. Honey, think about the family image. James is going to Italy. He's going to Paris. If you make a scene now, you'll ruin everything. Is that what you want? To be the daughter who destroyed her brother's honeymoon over a box of cards? She actually reached out to touch my arm, her fingers light and predatory. I flinched away before she could make contact. The internal contract I had signed with this family 31 years ago was not just broken, it was incinerated. We're leaving, I said. My voice was quiet, devoid of the jagged edges of a scream, which seemed to unnerve them more than an outburst would have. I didn't wait for a rebuttal or the inevitable wave of guilt-tripping that Matthew was already preparing. I simply reached down and took Thomas's hand. His grip was firm and steady, a silent confirmation of the path we were about to take. As we walked through the foyer past the framed family portraits that felt like indictments of a life lived for people who didn't value me, I didn't look back. The front door clicked shut behind us with a finality that signaled the end of my tenure as their reliable scapegoat. Behind that door, they were likely already celebrating their perceived victory toast with expensive wine to James's bright future. Out here, in the darkening driveway under the humid Nashville sky, the silence between me and Thomas was the loudest declaration of war I had ever made. The car door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the quiet, tree-lined street of Franklin, and I opened my laptop right there on the steering wheel, beginning to activate a process they never saw coming. Beside me, Thomas remained silent, his gaze fixed on the glowing screen. He didn't need to explain his cryptic words from the basement. I already knew what he was referring to. Years ago, my great-grandfather Arthur had pulled me aside long before his passing and handed me a set of notarized documents that my parents Matthew and Carolyn had clearly forgotten existed. He had established an irrevocable education trust for Thomas, placing the rare baseball card collection inside it as the primary asset. This wasn't just a box of sentimental paper, it was a legally shielded entity. Because it was an irrevocable trust, the cards didn't belong to me, and they certainly didn't belong to my parents or James. They were the sole property of the trust intended for Thomas's future university tuition, and nothing else. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the familiar rhythm of data entry providing a cold comfort. I logged into my banking portal first. Last month, under the guise of family solidarity, Matthew had pressured me into writing a check for $50,000 as a wedding gift for James and Clara. He had called it my contribution to the family legacy. I had written it quietly the way I always did, thinking that buying their peace was the same thing as being respected. My compassion had been a resource they had overdrawn for decades, but that account was finally closed. I initiated an immediate stop payment on the digital check. I didn't hesitate or wonder if James would be embarrassed when his honeymoon credit card started declining in Europe. This wasn't a breakdown of my character. It was a necessary audit of theirs. I watched the confirmation screen glow, transaction canceled. But the canceled check was just a warning shot. The real firepower lay in the federal statutes surrounding trust assets. James had sold those cards to a private collector in Florida, moving a registered trust asset across state lines without the trustee's consent. By doing so, and by Matthew and Carolyn accepting the $350,000 into their personal accounts to bypass gift taxes, they had stepped directly into the territory of federal wire fraud. In the eyes of the law, they weren't just a family having a disagreement. They were a criminal enterprise engaged in the illegal liquidation of a protected trust. I drafted a formal notice of theft and fraud attaching the original trust agreement Arthur had signed. I forwarded the entire file to Detective Miller, a contact I had maintained through my archival work with the state's historical registry. The most lethal strike, however, was aimed at the very roof over their heads. When I had restructured my parents' mortgage 5 years ago to save them from a previous financial blunder, the bank had required a secondary form of collateral. In their arrogance and haste to sign the papers, Matthew and Carolyn had agreed to a clause that linked the estate's landmark status and its associated historical trusts to the mortgage agreement. By allowing James to gut the library and steal the trust's assets, they had triggered a mandatory notice of non-compliance. I opened a secure window to their primary lender and began drafting a formal notification of collateral breach. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I was simply ensuring that the bank's risk assessment was accurate. If they wanted to treat family heritages as a personal slush fund, they could manage the legal complexities of a foreclosure without my professional oversight to shield them. I paused for a second, my cursor hovering over the final button. For 31 years, I had been the daughter who didn't make waves, the one who ensured the bills were paid, and the legacy was preserved while James was treated like a fragile work of art. They believed my talent for order was merely a convenience for them, a tool they could exploit whenever their greed exceeded their income. They were about to learn that in the world of professional accounting and trust law, the paper trail always leads back to the truth. I looked at Thomas, who gave me a sharp, knowing nod. I pressed send. The email vanished into the digital ether, a silent countdown to a reality none of them were prepared for. The fake piece of the Henderson family had just been dismantled by the very person who had built it. For the next 2 weeks, social media became the stage where James and Clara performed a regal life, funded by money that never belonged to them. Every time I refreshed my feed, a new reel of their self-indulgence appeared, dripping with filtered sunlight and artificial arrogance. There was James grinning in front of a fountain in Paris, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. There was Clara twirling in a boutique in Milan, surrounded by shopping bags from brands they couldn't have afforded in 3 lifetimes of honest work. They weren't just spending my son's future. They were broadcasting their theft to the world as if it were a merit badge of success. The caption on their latest post read, "Living our best life because we earned it," followed by a heart emoji. It was a masterpiece of entitlement, a digital monument to their belief that I was too weak to ever push back. The contrast between their vibrant, high-definition fantasy and my reality was stark. While they were sipping vintage wine in 5-star lounges, I was sitting in a quiet, dimly lit office across from Detective Miller. We spent hours meticulously documenting the digital paper trail that James had so arrogantly left behind. Every swipe of his credit card in Europe was a GPS ping on the map of his own downfall. Miller was a man of few words, a seasoned investigator who saw through the Henderson family's veneer of suburban respectability within minutes of reviewing the trust documents. He didn't see a family misunderstanding. He saw a clear-cut case of asset conversion and interstate fraud. We tracked the $350,000 as it moved from a private collector's escrow account into Matthew's personal savings, and then, with a reckless lack of caution, directly into James's travel fund. While I was building a federal case, my mother Carolyn continued to operate in a reality where I was still her subservient financial fixer. My phone vibrated constantly with her increasingly frantic and entitled text messages. She didn't ask how Thomas was doing or offer a single word of apology for the empty safe in the basement. Instead, she sent me photos of the utility bills for the Franklin estate. One message read, "Carmen, the electric bill is 3 days past due, and the pool heater needs servicing before your father's golf club dinner. Stop being childish and handle this immediately." She truly believed that our bond as a family was a one-way street where I provided the resources and she provided the demands. Her arrogance was so profound that she couldn't imagine a world where my archival and accounting skills were being used to dismantle her lifestyle rather than preserve it. I ignored every single one of her pings. The silence from my end must have been deafening to her, yet she interpreted it as a sign of my usual quiet compliance. She had spent 31 years training me to be the girl who didn't make waves, the reliable daughter who ensured the bills were paid, so the real main characters could bask in the sun. She didn't realize that a silent engine is often the most powerful one. In the quiet of my new apartment, Thomas and I didn't discuss the betrayal anymore. We focused on the mechanics of justice. Thomas would sit beside me as I reviewed the statutes, his small hand occasionally resting on my arm. He was no longer the invisible child. He was my silent partner in a game of high-stakes accounting. The sense of cat and mouse reached a fever pitch during the final days of their trip. Through Detective Miller's coordination with airport security and federal authorities, I knew exactly which flight James and Clara were booked on for their return. I knew their seat numbers, their scheduled arrival gate at Nashville International Airport, and the exact weight of the luxury luggage they would be hauling through customs. James thought he was coming home to a hero's welcome and a theater wing reveal party. He had no idea that the luxury lifestyle he was flaunting was actually a trail of breadcrumbs leading him directly into a cage. I watched the clock with a cold, clinical precision, knowing that the countdown to his reality check had already reached its final hours. Friday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Nashville International Airport became the final stop for James's glittering dream. The humid Tennessee air outside the terminal was thick, but inside the arrivals hall the atmosphere was clinical and cold. James and Clara stepped off the plane from Paris looking every bit like the elite socialites they imagined themselves to be. They walked with an insufferable gait, James adjusting his designer sunglasses, while Clara trailed behind him with a luggage cart stacked high with orange Hermes boxes and Italian leather bags. They were laughing, likely discussing where to display their new spoils in the Franklin estate, completely unaware that they were walking directly into a meticulously prepared vacuum. As they reached the customs secondary inspection area, the laughter died instantly. They weren't met by a chauffeur or a doting mother, but by Thom 2 Miller and 4 uniformed federal agents. The arrest was swift and devoid of the cinematic drama James probably would have preferred. Before he could utter a single word of protest about his rights or his family name, the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Miller read him his rights in a monotone voice that made the gravity of the situation feel like a heavy physical weight. Clara began to shriek a high-pitched sound of pure indignation until an agent informed her that every single luxury item in their possession was being seized as evidence of interstate fraud and asset conversion. They weren't just losing their vacation souvenirs, they were losing the very symbols of the status they had stolen from my son. While James was being escorted to a waiting black SUV in the airport's secure loading zone, a different kind of justice was unfolding 30 miles south in Franklin. At that exact moment, a team of local sheriff's deputies and a representative from the bank arrived at the gates of the Henderson estate. My father, Matthew, and my mother, Carolyn, were in the middle of preparing for a celebratory dinner, the table likely set with the fine china I had helped them preserve. They didn't get to finish their toast. The bank representative didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed Matthew a formal notice of foreclosure and an immediate order of eviction. Because they had facilitated the illegal sale of trust assets which served as collateral for their mortgage, the bank had exercised its right to accelerate the loan and seize the property. The scene at the house was one of chaotic, ungraceful desperation. Carolyn reportedly tried to bar the door, screaming about her lineage and her standing in the community, while Matthew stood on the manicured lawn clutching a single briefcase as movers began to tag the furniture. The landmark status they had used as a shield for decades had finally become their gallows. The very house they had gut-renovated with stolen funds was being locked behind them, its windows staring blankly like the eyes of a person who had finally seen through a long, elaborate lie. By sunset, the iron gates of the Franklin estate were chained shut, and the two people who had spent their lives demanding respect were standing on the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a handful of personal belongings. In stark contrast to the unfolding wreckage of the Henderson family, I was hundreds of miles away in a different state, sitting in a quiet, sun-drenched bistro with Thomas. We had left Tennessee days ago, moving into a modest but beautiful apartment near the coast, where the air smelled of salt instead of sawdust and betrayal. My phone sat on the edge of the table, its screen dark and silent. I had blocked their numbers and deactivated the family group chat the moment I saw Miller's confirmation text. There were no frantic explanations to give, no guilt-tripping rants to endure, and no more bills for me to pay. Thomas was calmly enjoying his dinner, his face relaxed for the first time in months. We didn't talk about James or the cards or the house we had left behind. Instead, we talked about his new school and the books he wanted to read. I watched him and felt a profound sense of relief. While my former family was drowning in the consequences of their own greed, I was finally breathing. The bridge had been burned, the debt had been collected, and for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't the one responsible for fixing the fire. The silence wasn't empty. It was a sanctuary. The cold fluorescence of the police station lights exposed the utter pathetic nature of the people who had once looked down on us. I stood in the hallway of the precinct, my briefcase in hand, watching through a heavy glass partition as Matthew and Carolyn sat slumped on a hard wooden bench. There was no arrogance left in the way Matthew held his head. His expensive silk tie was loosened and his face looked like a piece of crumpled parchment. Carolyn was trembling, her hands fluttering aimlessly around her pearl necklace as she whispered frantically to a public defender who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The suburban royalty of Franklin had been stripped of their crown, and all that remained were two elderly people facing the consequences of a life built on someone else's labor. When the detective led me into the small conference room for our final meeting, the silence was heavy. Carolyn immediately reached out, her eyes red and pleading. "Carmen, honey, thank God you're here." She began, her voice cracking with a manufactured vulnerability that no longer worked on me. "You have to tell them it was all a mistake. Tell them the cards were a family gift. James is in a cell. Carmen. They're talking about federal charges. You can fix this. You've always been the one to fix things." She actually looked at me as if I were still her personal assistant, her financial fixer who would sacrifice her son's future to keep the family's golden boy out of trouble. I didn't sit down. I stood across from them, the Irrevocable Trust documents spread out on the table like a roadmap to their downfall. "There is no fixing this, Carolyn," I said, my voice as cold and clinical as a bank audit. "James sold assets that he didn't own, and you accepted $350,000 into your accounts knowing it was stolen from Thomas. That isn't a family misunderstanding. That is wire fraud. That is a federal heritage felony. And because you used those funds to bypass your mortgage obligations, the bank has already started the foreclosure process on the Franklin house." Matthew flinched at the word foreclosure as if I had struck him. He tried to muster a spark of his old patriarchal rage, but his voice came out thin and weak. "We did it for the family. Carmen James needed a start. You have enough. Why must you be so vindictive?" "I'm not being vindictive, Matthew," I replied, looking him straight in the eyes. "I'm being accurate. You gambled your house and your reputation on James's greed, and you lost. I spent 15 years protecting you from your own bad decisions, but I will not protect you from the law when you target my son." The realization that I was no longer their shield seemed to shatter what was left of their composure. They weren't crying for the loss of our relationship. They were crying for the loss of their comfort. The disintegration of their fragile alliance was completed by Clara. She walked into the precinct an hour later, but she wasn't there to support James. She was accompanied by a sharp-suited lawyer and a pile of legal folders. Without shedding a single tear, she informed the officers that she was filing for an immediate annulment of her marriage to James. She claimed she had been misled about the source of the funds and had no intention of being dragged into a federal investigation. She looked at Matthew and Carolyn with a chilling indifference, treating them like a business merger that had gone south. The golden couple image she had spent months cultivating on Instagram was being erased in real time to save her own skin. She didn't even look toward the hallway where James was being held. The fake solidarity of the Henderson family had evaporated the moment the money ran out. I watched as the lawyer handed the papers to a stunned Matthew. The house was gone, the son was in a cell, and the daughter-in-law had fled. I had spent my life as the invisible engine keeping their world spinning, and by simply stepping away, I had allowed it all to collapse under the weight of their own corruption. I felt no pity, no regret, and no urge to offer a hand. The account of my empathy was officially closed, its doors barred and bolted. I turned around and walked out of the police station, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. I didn't look back at the desperate figures huddled under the fluorescent lights. I walked into the crisp night air toward the car, where Thomas was waiting, leaving the wreckage of their legacy in the rearview mirror where it belonged. 6 months later, in a completely new land, the past in Franklin remains only as a healed scar. The humid air of Tennessee has been replaced by a crisp, salty breeze that carries the scent of pine and ocean water. Here, no one knows me as the reliable daughter or the invisible fixer. We have built a life defined not by the demands of others, but by the quiet peace of our own choosing. Our new apartment is modest, filled with light, and books a sanctuary, where the only voices echoing off the walls are ones of honesty and laughter. The crushing weight of 31 years of subservience has finally evaporated, leaving behind a clarity that I never thought possible. The wreckage of the Henderson family we left behind served as a terminal diagnosis for their greed. James was sentenced to several years in federal prison for wire fraud and asset conversion, a reality that no amount of social media filtering could hide. Clara vanished almost immediately after the annulment was granted, taking what remained of their wedding gifts and leaving James to face the cold stone of a cell alone. As for Matthew and Carolyn, the fall from grace was absolute. With the Franklin estate sold at a public auction to cover the debts and restitution for the trust, they were forced to move into a cramped, rusted trailer in a park on the outskirts of the city. The friends they had spent decades trying to impress at the golf club didn't return their calls. In a world where status was their only currency, they had gone completely bankrupt. Through the diligent work of Detective Miller and the trust's insurance providers, the baseball card collection was eventually recovered from the private collector in Florida. It now sits in a secure, climate-controlled vault at a local bank under Thomas's name, where it will remain until he is ready for university. The physical objects were returned, but the real victory was the preservation of the legacy they tried to incinerate. As the sun begins to set over the horizon of our new home, casting long golden fingers of light across the balcony, Thomas and I stand together in the warmth of the evening. He holds the single most valuable card in his hand, the one depicting a legend from a century ago, and looks at it with a quiet, knowing smile. He doesn't see a dollar sign, he sees a promise kept. He turns to me, his eyes reflecting the amber glow of the sky, and says softly, "You see, Mom." The truth always has a way of coming to light. Watching him, I realize that the most important thing I saved wasn't a box of cards. It was my son's belief in justice. My life has been a long, difficult lesson in the mechanics of human nature. I've learned that kindness without boundaries is not a virtue. It is a slow form of suicide. When you allow people to bond-root your soul under the guise of family loyalty, you aren't being a good person, you are simply subsidizing their cruelty. Blood may be thicker than water, but it is not a chain that gives anyone the right to drown you. I had to learn the hard way that cutting off a toxic limb is the only way to save the rest of the body. If you are listening to this, and you feel like an invisible engine in your own family, always the one giving while others take, let my story be your wake-up call. Setting a boundary is not a betrayal. It is a restoration of your own worth. True power doesn't come from the status you project or the house you inhabit. It comes from the knowledge of who you are and the legal literacy to protect what you love. Legal knowledge was the weapon I used to defend Thomas, but my own self-respect was the shield that finally made me bulletproof. Thomas tucks the card back into its protective sleeve and looks out at the ocean. There are no construction noises here, no frantic text messages demanding I pay a bill, and no parents viewing me as a supporting character in their narcissistic play. We are no longer defined by what we can provide for people who don't value us. We are defined by this moment, this freedom, and the limitless horizon ahead of us. The house finally knows who it is, for it is for the people who tell the truth. As the first stars begin to appear, we both smile, ready for a new chapter filled with liberty, peace, and the absolute beauty of a life lived on our own terms.